Good morning. Welcome to Connect Daily Bread, where we believe that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Today's reading is in Acts chapter 14. Here we go. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. In Lystra, there was a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Saul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He's provided you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. "We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God," they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church. With prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord, in whom they'd put their trust. After going through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. When they'd preached the word in Perga, they went to Attalia. From Attalia, they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So it picks up in the city of Iconium. Paul and Barnabas went as usual to the Jewish synagogue, and they spoke very effectively the good news of Jesus. And God confirmed this message by performing signs and wonders through them. And many people respond and come to the faith, but also there were many people agitated by this. So there's a plot afoot that they were going to try to stone him, so they ditched there and head to Lystra and Derbe. And things really aren't much better in Lystra and Derbe, though initially there's a great, incredible enthusiasm, misplaced enthusiasm. There ends up being a stoning that takes place there in this Lystra and Derbe. And so as Paul's proclaiming the message, he looks at a lame guy. It's never walked before. He saw he had faith to be healed. He said, "Get up, stand up, and walk." And so he does so. And the people respond by thinking that their Greek gods have come down from heaven. And Paul, because he was the talker, they thought he was Hermes, and they thought Barnabas was Zeus. And now they're trying to sacrifice to them. The priest of Zeus is coming. Man, it just looks like absolute commotion and mayhem afoot. And they run out into the crowd, Paul and Barnabas do, and tell them to stop with this. This is the very thing we're trying to turn you from. These idols, they're worthless. They're not real. They can't hear you. They can't heal. They can't do anything. They have no power. And so they give quite an offensive message to try to get them to stop from worshiping to them. It sounds like they still had difficulty getting that message across. And the thing about mobs is that they're very fickle, right? So then some Jews come from Antioch and stir up the crowd. And now the mob that was once trying to worship them and praise them as gods ends up stoning them and leaving Paul for dead. Now God intervenes and Paul rises back up. But that's a takeaway for you and I of to not, for good or ill, to give much mind to what the masses have to think of us, have to say about us. Right? Our focus needs to be on faithfulness to Christ and what ultimately he thinks of us and has to say about us. So they get right back to work. They preach the gospel in, where'd they go next? So they return to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. There they strengthen the disciples and they encourage them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. And there would be some real credibility to this message after seeing what they had just endured. But the call is not to back off or to slow down, but to stay faithful, to press on. And they appoint elders, which is the New Testament practice for these churches that have sprung up. And we see, right, in Titus, and we see in the letters to Timothy, the criterion that they looked for with elders who would ultimately be entrusted to care for the flock, to care for that church. And so they do that. And then they head back to base, to Antioch, where they had initially been commissioned for this work, this first missionary journey of theirs. And they share all that God had been doing there through them, and the way that, again, the door of faith had been opened to the Gentiles. So the fulfillment of the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations is truly happening. It's there's no barrier, no cultural barrier. God has done away with all that, and he's bringing anyone and everyone into his kingdom, which is really good news for us who are not of Jewish heritage. And so we just see right now there's a shift that's taking place in the book of Acts, and will carry on to where Paul will become a central figure, as you've seen in the last few chapters, starting in chapter 13, but where Luke, who is a companion of Paul, will be sharing as he travels with Paul what had taken place, what God did through the Apostle Paul. So those are my takeaways from today's reading. Love you guys. Hope you have a great day.